Hi friends, welcome back to another story. Before there were kings or cities, before laws were carved into stone or gods were given names, there was only the land and people learning how to survive upon it. From fragile beginnings beside rivers and fires, humanity built something it believed would last forever. Towering cities, sacred laws, divine rulers, and empires that claim the world itself. But greatness carries a price. Power concentrates, belief hardens, nature resists, and the same forces that create civilization begin to pull it apart. This is the story of how one of the world's greatest ancient civilizations rose from silence, reached astonishing glory, and slowly collapsed under the weight of its own ambition, leaving behind echoes that still shape how we live today. Long before history learned to speak in dates and before stone was shaped into monuments or words were carved into clay, there was only the land and the people who learned to listen to it. The land was old, far older than memory. Rivers cut through it like living veins, carrying silt from distant mountains and laying it gently upon the plains year after year. In the dry seasons, the earth cracked and hardened beneath the sun. In the wet seasons, it softened and breathed, ready to receive seed and promise. To the east, hills rose in uneven waves, their shadows stretching long at dawn. To the west, marshlands shimmered under pale skies, alive with birds and insects whose calls filled the air like an unseen choir. This was not a gentle land, but it was a generous one to those who understood its rhythms. The first people did not come as conquerors. They came as wanderers. They followed the movement of animals and the slow turning of seasons, reading the land the way later generations would read stars and scriptures. Their shelters were temporary, built from reeds, hides, and wood, meant to last only until the earth whispered that it was time to move again. Fire was their most sacred companion, a gift wrested from nature that brought warmth, protection, and the first sense of mastery over a vast and indifferent world. These people had no cities, no kings, no written laws. Yet their lives were not without order. Elders remembered paths and stories. Hunters learned patience and silence. Gatherers learned which plants healed and which killed. Children grew up watching the horizon, understanding that survival depended not on domination, but on balance. The river was their teacher. It flooded without warning, destroyed without mercy, and yet left behind black soil richer than any gift the people had known. At first, the floods were feared as acts of anger, signs that unseen forces were displeased, but slowly, understanding took root. Where the waters withdrew, plants grew taller, game returned, life flourished. What seemed like destruction carried within it the secret of abundance. It was here on these riverbanks that destiny first stirred. Some families lingered longer after the floods receded. They noticed that seeds discarded near camps sprouted unexpectedly. They observed that plants returned to the same places year after year. With cautious experimentation, they pressed seeds into the soft earth and waited. When green shoots emerged where their hands had touched the soil, the world changed forever. The people were no longer merely guests upon the land. They became its partners. Farming was not an instant triumph. Crops failed. Pests devoured harvests. Floods came too early or too late. But each failure carried knowledge, and knowledge became power. The people learned to dig channels to guide water, to store grain against famine, to plan not just for tomorrow, but for generations unborn. As fields replaced forests and paths became permanent roads, the wandering slowed. Villages formed, clusters of homes bound together by shared labor and shared fate. With permanence came new ideas: ownership, territory, inheritance. And with those ideas came conflict. Disputes over land and water could no longer be solved by simply moving on. Elders gained authority not only through wisdom, but through control. Strong voices emerged, men and women whose decisions shaped the survival of many. Leadership was no longer optional. It was essential. The people began to mark time. They noticed patterns in the sky, the return of certain stars, the predictable march of the sun, the moon's steady cycles. These celestial movements were tied to planting and harvest, to floods and droughts. The sky became a map, and those who could read it gained reverence. Early priests and astronomers emerged, blurring the line between knowledge and the sacred. Belief followed understanding. The land was no longer just soil and stone. It was alive with unseen forces. Rivers were spirits, storms were voices. Fertility was a blessing granted by powers beyond human reach. The people told stories to explain what they could not yet control, weaving myths that gave meaning to suffering and hope to struggle. At night, around shared fires, these stories grew more elaborate. Heroes emerged, figures who spoke to gods, who taught laws, who brought fire or farming or order to chaos. Whether these figures truly lived mattered less than what they represented. The belief that the people's existence had purpose, that their survival was not random, but destined. As villages grew, so did the need for cooperation. Irrigation systems required collective labor. Storage demanded trust. Defense against rival groups required unity. What had once been small, kin-based communities slowly fused into larger societies, bound by shared rituals, shared gods, and shared fears. The first walls were not built to keep others out, but to hold the people together. Crafts emerged alongside agriculture, pottery for storage, tools for farming, ornaments for identity. Specialization followed necessity. Some became builders, others healers, others storytellers whose memory preserved the past. Trade began cautiously, first between nearby settlements, then farther afield. Obsidian, shells, rare stones, objects traveled great distances, carrying with them ideas and influence. With trade came awareness, the knowledge that the world was vast and not all people lived as they did. This awareness planted both curiosity and anxiety. If others existed, they might be friends or threats. The need for protection sharpened. Weapons improved. Watchtowers appeared. Warriors gained status, standing beside farmers and priests as pillars of survival. Yet even as conflict loomed, cooperation deepened. Rituals marked life's passages. Birth, adulthood, death. Burial practices became more elaborate, reflecting growing beliefs about the afterlife. The dead were no longer simply gone. They watched, guided, and judged. Ancestors became guardians, linking the living to a timeless chain of existence. Memory itself became sacred. Without writing, history lived in song and ceremony. Victories were celebrated. Disasters were mourned and remembered as warnings. Each generation inherited not just land and tools, but identity, a shared understanding of who they were and where they belonged. Over time, certain places gained special significance. A bend in the river where floods always receded first. A hill where the sun rose perfectly aligned on a sacred day. A grove where rituals seemed especially powerful. These places became centers, spiritual and social hearts around which communities organized themselves. From these centers, power radiated. Leaders emerged who claimed not just practical authority, but divine favor. They spoke as intermediaries between the people and the unseen forces that governed existence. Their words shaped law. Their judgments shaped morality. Their lineage became sacred. The seeds of kingship were sown long before the first crown was forged. And yet, beneath the growing structures of power, the land remained the ultimate master. A single failed flood could undo years of planning. A prolonged drought could erase entire villages. Nature reminded the people, again and again, that control was always partial, and survival always fragile. This tension between mastery and humility defined the era before dawn. The people stood at the threshold of something immense, though they could not yet see its shape. They had learned to stay, to build, to remember. They had begun to imagine permanence in a world that had always been fleeting. Children born in these villages would grow up knowing no other way of life. To them, fields and homes and rituals would seem eternal. They would inherit a world already leaning toward complexity, already heavy with expectation. What none of them could yet know was that these early choices, where to settle, how to farm, whom to trust, what to believe, were shaping a future far larger than their lives. Cities would rise where their huts once stood. Laws would be carved where stories were once sung. Empires would claim divine mandate from gods first imagined beside simple fires. But for now, in this fragile beginning, there was only the land, the people, and the quiet certainty that survival had given birth to destiny. The dawn of civilization had not yet broken, but the sky was already beginning to glow. The age of wandering had ended, but the age of certainty had not yet begun. Across the river plains and rising foothills, people now lived rooted to the land. Villages dotted the landscape like scattered stars, each bound by blood, memory, and shared labor. They farmed the same soil, worshipped familiar spirits, and defended the same boundaries. Yet beyond the fields and reed houses lay other communities, similar yet different. Their accents varied. Their rituals followed different moons. Their gods bore other names. At first, these differences mattered little. Distance softened rivalry. Trade passed quietly along river routes, and occasional disputes were settled through gifts or cautious avoidance. But as populations grew and land became precious, separation turned into tension. The tribes began to notice one another, not as neighbors, but as competitors. Water was the first cause of conflict. Control of irrigation channels meant survival during dry seasons, and a diverted stream could starve an entire settlement. Arguments over access hardened into skirmishes. Skirmishes became raids. Raids demanded warriors, and warriors required leaders. Leadership changed shape in those years. Once, authority had rested with elders, keepers of memory and tradition. Their power came from experience and consensus. But conflict demanded speed and decisiveness. A council could debate, but a battle required command. Strong individuals rose to prominence, chosen not by age alone, but by courage, charisma, and the ability to inspire fear or loyalty. These war leaders did not rule villages. They protected them. At least that was how it began. Victories brought prestige. Prestige attracted followers. Soon, a single leader might command warriors from several villages, binding them through promises of protection and shared spoils. Tribal banners, once symbols of kinship, became markers of allegiance. The people learned to fight not only for their families, but for something larger, a collective identity still being formed. Yet warfare alone could not sustain unity. Between conflicts, life continued. Crops had to be planted, disputes settled, rituals observed. The growing web of alliances demanded rules, agreements that extended beyond individual villages. Custom hardened into law, spoken aloud in gatherings where leaders swore oaths before gods and people alike. Breaking such an oath was no longer a personal failing. It was a crime against the community. As cooperation expanded, so did ambition. Leaders who once defended borders now sought to control them. Strategic locations, river crossings, fertile basins, hilltops, became prizes worth conquering. Some tribes absorbed others through marriage and alliance. Others did so through force. Conquered peoples were not always destroyed. Often they were integrated. Their gods merged. Their customs selectively preserved. Unity was built as much through compromise as conquest. The first true towns emerged from this process. Unlike villages, they were not bound to a single lineage. They were centers, places where trade converged, rituals intensified, and authority resided. Walls rose not just to repel enemies, but to define belonging. Inside the walls, identity shifted. People were no longer simply members of a tribe, they were citizens of a place. This shift was profound and unsettling. Old loyalties did not vanish easily. Some resisted centralized authority, clinging to ancestral autonomy. Rebellions flared, leaders fell, but the momentum toward unity proved difficult to stop. The benefits were undeniable. Coordinated defense, reliable food storage, organized labor, and expanded trade networks. Security bred prosperity, and prosperity bred acceptance. To govern these growing populations, leadership required legitimacy beyond strength. Force could seize control, but it could not hold it indefinitely. Rulers needed justification, something that made obedience feel natural, even sacred. The divine provided the answer. Priests, already respected as interpreters of the unseen, aligned themselves with emerging rulers. Victories were declared signs of divine favor. Disasters were blamed on disobedience. Rituals crowned leaders not merely as commanders, but as chosen intermediaries between the human and the eternal. Power became sanctified. The throne, whether a literal seat or a symbolic position, represented more than authority. It embodied order itself. To challenge the ruler was to challenge the gods, the laws, and the fragile stability that kept chaos at bay. This belief reshaped society. Hierarchy emerged clearly for the first time. At the top stood the ruler and their household. Beneath them, priests and officials managed ritual and administration. Warriors enforced law and protected borders. Artisans, farmers, and laborers sustained the economy. Each role was defined, valued, and constrained. Not everyone benefited equally. Inequality deepened as power concentrated. Tribute replaced voluntary sharing. Labor was demanded, not requested. Those at the margins, former tribal leaders, displaced families, conquered peoples, felt the weight of unification most sharply. Yet even resentment rarely overcame necessity. Fragmentation meant vulnerability. Unity, however imperfect, meant survival. The first laws were spoken before they were written. They addressed theft, violence, marriage, debt, and duty. Punishments were harsh, but predictable. For the first time, justice was standardized, no longer dependent solely on kinship or revenge. This predictability, though often cruel, created stability. People learned what was expected of them, and what they could expect in return. With stability came ambition on a new scale. Public works transformed the landscape. Canals stretched across plains. Roads linked distant settlements. Granaries rose as symbols of collective security. These projects demanded coordination beyond any single tribe's capacity, reinforcing the necessity of centralized authority. The people began to think in generations. Time itself was reorganized. Calendars marked agricultural cycles and sacred festivals. Rulers dated their reigns, anchoring memory to leadership. History shifted from mythic cycles to linear progression, one ruler, one era replacing another. The past was no longer just remembered. It was recorded. Though writing was still in its infancy, or not yet born, symbols and tallies tracked goods and labor. Messengers carried commands across expanding territories. Communication became a tool of governance, shrinking distances and extending control. The ruler's voice could now reach far beyond their presence. As unity solidified, external threats intensified. Neighboring regions watched the growing power with fear and envy. Border clashes escalated into wars of expansion or defense. The unified civilization, forged through internal struggle, now faced the outside world as a single entity. Victory reinforced identity. Songs celebrated collective triumphs. Monuments commemorated battles. The people began to speak of themselves as one, children of the same land, protected by the same gods, ruled by the same throne. Yet unity came at a cost. The old tribal stories faded, replaced by state-sanctioned narratives. Local gods were diminished or absorbed. Traditions deemed inconvenient were discouraged or erased. Memory was curated, shaped to serve the needs of authority. What was gained in strength was lost in diversity. Still, for most, life improved in tangible ways. Famine became less frequent. Trade brought goods once unimaginable. Peace, though imperfect, lasted longer than before. Parents believed their children might live safer lives than they had known. That belief alone justified much. At the center of it all sat the throne, a symbol born from centuries of struggle, compromise, fear, and hope. It was not inevitable. It was chosen, forged by countless decisions made by ordinary people seeking security in an uncertain world. From scattered tribes emerged a unified civilization. Not by accident, but by necessity. The transformation was neither complete nor flawless. Beneath the surface, tensions remained between ruler and ruled, tradition and change, unity and freedom. These tensions would one day shape both greatness and collapse. But for now, the throne stood firm. And beneath its shadow, civilization took its first confident steps into history. Before laws were carved into stone, before crowns were shaped from gold, power was spoken in whispers. To the sky, to the river, to the unseen forces believed to govern all things. The people had always feared what they could not control. Floods arrived without mercy. Storms shattered fields in a single night. Disease moved silently through villages, claiming the young and strong without warning. In the face of such uncertainty, survival demanded explanation. And so the gods were born, not as distant abstractions, but as living presences woven into every breath of existence. The world, the people believed, was not empty. It was crowded with intention. The sun did not rise by chance. It was lifted by a divine hand. The river did not flood randomly. It was commanded. Fertility, famine, victory, defeat, all were expressions of sacred will. To live was to exist under constant observation, judged by forces older and greater than humanity itself. At first, the gods were many. Each village honored its own spirits, guardians of springs, hills, forests, and ancestors. These deities were intimate, familiar, often unpredictable. They required offerings, songs, and respect, but they were not distant rulers of the cosmos. They were neighbors in an invisible realm, capable of both kindness and cruelty. As villages merged into towns and towns into cities, belief transformed alongside power. Local spirits began to merge into greater gods. The river became a single divine being rather than many. The sky gained a supreme authority. Creation myths evolved, explaining not just the land, but the order of society itself. The gods were no longer merely forces of nature, they became architects of hierarchy. The universe, according to these myths, was structured, just like the emerging civilization. At the top stood the high gods, eternal and commanding. Beneath them were lesser deities, spirits, and ancestors. Humanity occupied a fragile position in between, dependent on favor and obedience. This cosmic order mirrored earthly rule, reinforcing the idea that hierarchy was natural, necessary, and sacred. Priests were the first to understand the power of this symmetry. They claimed knowledge of divine will, interpreting dreams, reading signs in the stars, listening to omens in the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals. Their authority came not from force, but from fear and faith. They spoke when others dared not, claiming the gods' voices as their own. To challenge a priest was to risk divine punishment. As rulers rose to prominence, they recognized the value of this sacred authority. Strength alone could conquer, but belief could bind. A ruler blessed by the gods did not merely command obedience, they deserved it. Thus began the alliance between throne and temple. Kings were no longer just war leaders or administrators. They became chosen ones. appointed by divine will, descended from gods, or even gods themselves in mortal form. Coronations became sacred rituals rich with symbolism, anointing with holy oils, donning of ritual garments, oaths sworn before altars. The moment of ascension was framed not as a political act, but as a cosmic event. Myths were reshaped to support this vision. Stories told of divine ancestors who founded the city. Tales described gods granting laws directly to rulers. Victories in battle were proclaimed miracles. Defeats were explained as tests or punishments for insufficient devotion. History was no longer remembered as it happened. It was remembered as it needed to be. The people embraced these stories, not blindly, but willingly. Belief offered comfort. If the ruler was divinely chosen, then suffering had meaning. If the gods governed fate, then chaos was not random. Rituals promised protection, forgiveness, and hope in a world still governed by forces beyond human control. Temples rose as the physical embodiment of sacred power. They were built larger and higher than any other structure, dominating city skylines. Their stones were laid with ceremony, aligned with celestial events and adorned with symbols of divine authority. Inside, incense burned day and night. Offerings flowed in, grain, livestock, precious metals, fueling both religious devotion and economic power. The temple became the heart of civilization. Priests controlled calendars, determining when crops were planted and festivals held. They preserved knowledge, guarded myths, and educated future leaders. In many ways, they were the first bureaucrats, though cloaked in ritual rather than administration. Religion structured time itself. Days were divided by prayers. Years were defined by sacred cycles. Life was punctuated by rituals, birth blessings, coming-of-age ceremonies, marriage rites, funerary offerings. Each stage reinforced the idea that existence unfolded according to divine design. The ruler stood at the center of this sacred system. As intermediary between gods and people, the king performed rituals no one else could. Only they could dedicate temples, lead certain sacrifices, or proclaim sacred laws. Their body was sacred. Their words carried divine weight. To obey the king was to obey the gods. This belief was enforced not only through faith, but through spectacle. Public rituals displayed divine favor. Processions, sacrifices, festivals that dazzled the senses. The people watched as priests invoked blessings, as rulers appeared adorned with symbols of cosmic authority. The message was unmistakable. Order flowed from the gods, through the ruler to the people. Dissent became heresy. To question authority was not just rebellion, it was sacrilege. Punishment for disobedience was framed as divine justice, rather than human cruelty. This shifted blame away from rulers, reinforcing their image as instruments rather than authors of power. Yet belief was never absolute. Some doubted quietly. Some noticed that the gods always favored the powerful. Others questioned why disasters struck the faithful as often as the wicked. These doubts rarely formed open resistance, but they lingered beneath the surface, shaping personal faith in private ways. Still, the system endured, because it worked. Religion unified diverse populations under shared myths. It legitimized laws and taxes. It justified war and conquest. It soothed fear and inspired loyalty. Sacred power transformed fragile unity into enduring civilization. Over time, the myths grew more elaborate. Creation stories explain not just the world, but social roles. Men and women, nobles and laborers, rulers and ruled. Each had a divinely ordained place. Changing one's position was no longer merely difficult, it was unnatural. The divine right to rule became unquestionable truth. The ruler's failures were reframed as the people's faults. Famine meant insufficient devotion. Defeat meant broken taboos. Redemption required obedience, sacrifice, and renewed faith, not reform. This belief system forged extraordinary stability. Generations lived and died under the same sacred order, rarely imagining alternatives. Children were taught from birth that the ruler's authority was eternal, that the gods watched all actions. That tradition was truth. But within this sacred certainty lay the seeds of future conflict. As society grew more complex, contradictions emerged. Wealth concentrated in temples and palaces. Ritual demands increased, even as hardship spread. When suffering became unbearable, belief began to fracture. Yet for now, sacred power reigned supreme. The gods ruled the heavens. The king ruled the earth. And between them, humanity lived, obeyed, and believed. In this age, power was not merely enforced, it was worshipped. And as long as the people believed that their rulers spoke with divine voices, civilization stood unchallenged beneath the watchful eyes of the gods. When the age of sacred myths fused with the age of human ambition, kingship was no longer an idea. It became an institution. The first kings did not inherit fully formed thrones. They stepped into a world still uncertain, still fragile, where authority had to be proven every day. The gods might have chosen them, but belief alone could not resolve disputes, organize labor, or restrain violence. Civilization had grown too large, too complex to be governed by ritual and charisma alone. Order was now as necessary as faith. In the early years of kingship, power was personal. The king was visible, present, and accessible. He walked among the people, judged disputes in public spaces, and led warriors into battle. His authority lived in his actions as much as his title. To rule was to be seen ruling, but visibility brought danger. As populations expanded and cities swelled, conflicts multiplied. Disputes over land, inheritance, marriage, trade, and debt became constant. Blood feuds threatened stability. Old tribal customs clashed with new civic realities. What had once been resolved by kinship councils now demanded impartial authority. The king became the final voice. Judgment was one of the earliest and most powerful tools of kingship. People brought their grievances before the ruler, believing, because they were taught to believe, that he embodied both divine will and human reason. His decisions were absolute. There was no appeal beyond the throne. At first, these rulings were remembered orally. Precedent mattered. What the king decided once became a guide for the next dispute. Over time, patterns emerged. Justice began to resemble a system rather than a series of isolated commands. Thus, law was born. The earliest laws were simple and harsh. They focused on preserving order rather than fairness. Theft threatened survival. Violence disrupted productivity. Disobedience challenged authority. Punishments were severe, not because rulers were cruel, but because fear was effective. Predictability mattered more than mercy. The people learned that actions carried consequences. For the first time, justice extended beyond family loyalty. A stranger could appeal to the king. A noble could be punished, though often differently from a commoner. Equality did not exist, but consistency did. Law reshaped society. To enforce it, the king required agents. Guards, officials, messengers, roles emerged that existed solely to carry out royal will. These men answered not to tribes or families, but to the crown. Loyalty shifted from kinship to institution. This shift was revolutionary. Authority was no longer scattered among many voices. It flowed from a single source. The king's word defined reality. Boundaries were drawn. Taxes were levied. Labor was demanded. The state, though not yet named, had taken its first breath. Administration followed necessity. Records became essential. Grain stores were counted. Tribute was tracked. Workers were assigned to public projects. Symbols replaced memory. Marks, tokens, early writing systems that allowed authority to extend beyond presence. For the first time, power became abstract. The king could rule without being seen. Orders traveled on clay, stone, or messenger's breath. Law became permanent, no longer dependent on the ruler's mood or memory. Some laws were carved into stone and displayed publicly, not to empower the people, but to remind them that justice was fixed and unavoidable. Ignorance was no defense. These inscriptions served another purpose: legacy. By recording laws, kings declared themselves eternal. Even after death, their authority would speak. Their vision of order would shape generations yet unborn. Kingship became larger than any one man. Still, the first kings ruled a delicate balance. Too much force bred rebellion. Too much leniency bred chaos. Authority had to feel inevitable, not oppressive. Divinely ordained, yet practically useful. Ritual reinforced this balance. Kings appeared in ceremonial roles as lawgivers, builders, and protectors. They dedicated temples, inaugurated canals, and presided over festivals. These acts linked law with prosperity, authority with abundance. If order brought full granaries and safe streets, then obedience felt rational. But law was not neutral. It reflected the priorities of power. Nobles received lighter punishments. Priests were often exempt. Debtors could be enslaved. Women's rights were defined narrowly. Justice preserved hierarchy as much as harmony. The people accepted this because hierarchy felt natural. From birth, each person learned their place. The king stood at the summit, not because he was strongest, but because he was necessary. Without him, law dissolved. Without law, order collapsed. Without order, survival failed. Fear and gratitude intertwined. The king's palace became the center of governance. It was not merely a residence, but an administrative heart, where judgments were made, records kept, tribute stored, and power displayed. Its walls separated ruler from ruled, elevating authority through distance. Access became privilege. Over time, the king's presence grew rarer. Officials spoke in his name. Judges enforced his laws. The ruler became symbolic as much as practical, an embodiment of order, rather than its daily executor. This transformation strengthened authority. To disobey an official was to disobey the king. To disobey the king was to defy the gods. Law, power, and belief fused into a single structure, resilient, commanding, and difficult to challenge. Yet cracks formed quietly. Some laws bred resentment. Forced labor drained communities. Taxes weighed heavily in poor seasons. Justice, though predictable, was not always just. Murmurs spread in marketplaces and homes, rarely spoken aloud but deeply felt. Kings responded with reform or repression. Some adjusted laws to ease tension, presenting mercy as divine generosity. Others doubled down, believing fear ensured obedience. The shape of authority varied from ruler to ruler, but the structure endured. For the first time, civilization understood itself as governed. Chaos had been tamed, not eliminated, but constrained. Violence was monopolized by the state. Justice was centralized. Power had a face, a voice, and a throne. The first kings did more than rule. They defined what authority meant. They transformed leadership into law, custom into command, belief into governance. Their legacy was not their victories or monuments, but the idea that society could be shaped deliberately, ordered by human hands claiming divine sanction. This idea would outlive them all. Long after their names faded, their systems remained. Law would evolve, authority would fracture and reform, kings would rise and fall. But the shape of power, the belief that order must flow from a central source, was now embedded in civilization's foundation. The throne had found its purpose, and beneath it humanity learned to live not just together, but governed. Civilization learned to endure when it learned to build. In the earliest days, shelters were made to disappear. Reed walls bent with the wind. Mud bricks dissolved back into earth after heavy rain. Wood rotted, burned, or was reclaimed by the land that birthed it. These structures served life, but they did not outlast it. They were humble, temporary, and forgettable. Then came stone. Stone did not bend. It did not decay with seasons. It resisted fire, flood, and time itself. To shape it required effort beyond survival, planning, coordination, and patience. To build with stone was to declare permanence in a world that had never promised it. The decision to build in stone was a declaration of ambition. At first, stone was used sparingly. Foundations were reinforced. Sacred places were marked. A single standing pillar or altar distinguished the divine from the ordinary. These early structures were not grand, but they were deliberate. They announced that certain spaces mattered more than others, that some ideas deserved to endure. Fire made this transformation possible. Kilns hardened bricks, metal tools sharpened precision, controlled heat turned raw materials into instruments of authority. Fire, once a source of warmth and protection, became a tool of creation, an extension of human will imposed upon nature. Architecture became power made visible. As kingship solidified and sacred authority deepened, rulers sought ways to make their dominance unmistakable. Words could be forgotten, rituals faded with memory, but stone endured. A wall could not be argued with. A tower could not be ignored. The first monumental projects were communal. Walls protected cities from enemies and floods alike. Canals guided water across fields, transforming barren land into abundance. Roads connected settlements, binding distant communities into a single political body. These projects demanded labor on a scale never before attempted. No single family could build a city. Thousands worked together. Farmers during flood seasons, prisoners of war, conscripted laborers fulfilling obligations to crown and temple. Each stone laid was a testament not only to engineering skill, but to centralized authority capable of commanding human effort. Engineering reshaped the land. Rivers were diverted, marshes drained, hills leveled. What had once been feared as untamable forces were now challenged by design. Dams regulated floods. Irrigation networks fed entire populations. Bridges spanned obstacles that once divided regions. Nature was no longer just endured, it was negotiated with. This mastery bred confidence. Confidence bred grandeur. Temples rose higher, palaces wider, city gates more imposing. Architecture adopted symbolism. Columns represented cosmic order. Stairways mirrored the ascent to the heavens. Walls told stories through reliefs carved into stone. Victories, rituals, divine encounters frozen in time. Buildings became narratives. To enter a temple was to walk through myth. To stand before a palace was to feel small before authority. Space itself was used to shape emotion, fear, awe, reverence, obedience. Nothing was accidental. Cities were planned with intention. Sacred centers aligned with celestial events. Streets followed hierarchical logic, guiding processions and controlling movement. Markets were placed near temples, blending commerce with faith. Administrative buildings clustered near palaces, ensuring power remained centralized. The city became a machine. Every structure had purpose. Every purpose reinforced order. Architecture was not art alone. It was governance carved into stone. Yet the labor behind these wonders was immense. Quarries echoed with hammer blows. Workers hauled blocks across vast distances using sledges, ropes, and sheer determination. Injuries were common. Death was accepted as part of duty. To build for eternity often meant sacrificing the present. The people endured because they believed. They believed the structures honored gods, protected communities, and secured the future. They believed their labor connected them to something larger than themselves. And often they were right. Walls saved lives. Canals prevented famine. Roads brought trade and prosperity. Monuments rewarded obedience with stability. For rulers, architecture was legacy, A king's reign was measured not only in years, but in structures left behind. To build was to assert worthiness. To leave no monument was to risk being forgotten. Names were carved into cornerstones. Statues bore likenesses idealized beyond mortality. Stone granted immortality. As techniques advanced, so did ambition. Builders learned to shape arches, vaults, and terraces. They refined proportions. They mastered balance and weight distribution. Engineering knowledge passed from generation to generation, guarded by specialists whose expertise became invaluable. Craftsmen gained status. Stonecutters, architects, and engineers formed elite classes, often protected by the state. Their skills were secrets of power. A poorly built wall could doom a city. A collapsed canal could starve thousands. Precision became sacred. Fire refined materials further. Metallurgy produced stronger tools. Bronze and later iron chisels cut deeper and cleaner. Kilns produced standardized bricks. Glass, glaze, and pigment added color and meaning to stone surfaces. Monuments grew not just larger, but more intricate. Reliefs depicted entire histories. Inscriptions proclaimed laws and divine favor. Art merged with architecture, turning buildings into instruments of memory. The city became a living archive. But monumentality carried risk. The more a civilization built, the more it had to maintain. Walls cracked, canals silted, temples demanded constant repair. Each structure bound the future to the past, requiring labor long after its builders were gone. Permanence created obligation. As resources flowed into construction, questions arose. Why build higher when fields needed tending? Why decorate temples while people struggled? These questions were rarely voiced openly, but they lingered. Rulers responded with spectacle. Grand inaugurations celebrated completed works. Festivals glorified construction as divine achievement. The people were reminded that monuments belonged to everyone, even as access remained limited. Architecture masked inequality with grandeur. Still, the psychological power of stone endured. To stand before massive walls was to feel protected. To gaze upon towering temples was to believe in order. The built environment shaped thought as surely as law shaped behavior. Children grew up surrounded by permanence. They knew no world without walls, streets, and sacred spaces. To them, civilization felt eternal. The idea that stone could fall, that fire could destroy, seemed unthinkable. Yet history would prove otherwise. For now, stone and fire defined an era. Humanity had learned not only to survive, but to imprint its will upon the earth. Architecture and engineering transformed landscapes into symbols of power, faith, and ambition. These monuments were more than buildings. They were promises of protection, of divine favor, of continuity. They proclaimed that civilization had arrived, and that it intended to last forever. Whether it would, only time would decide. Every civilization dreams of a moment when struggle gives way to confidence, when survival is no longer the only concern and life expands into beauty, learning, and abundance. For this civilization, that moment arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first, before revealing itself as an age unlike any before it. The fields were full. Years of careful irrigation, disciplined labor, and accumulated knowledge had tamed the uncertainties of nature. Floods were anticipated, not feared. Granaries overflowed with surplus grain, enough to feed cities through lean seasons and to trade beyond borders. Hunger, once a constant threat, became an occasional hardship rather than a certainty. Wealth followed stability. Markets grew crowded and vibrant. Merchants arrived from distant lands with goods once thought mythical. Rare stones, fine metals, exotic woods, dyes drawn from plants and creatures unknown to local soil. In exchange, the civilization offered grain, textiles, crafted tools, and finished goods shaped by skilled hands. Trade routes stretched like arteries across the known world. Caravans crossed deserts. Boats followed rivers and coastlines. With goods came ideas, new techniques, unfamiliar beliefs, foreign music and styles of dress. The world felt larger, and the people felt themselves part of it. For the first time, prosperity touched many layers of society. Farmers enjoyed more predictable lives. Artisans refined their crafts beyond necessity, creating objects not just useful, but beautiful. Goldsmiths shaped ornaments that shimmered in sunlight. Weavers produced fabrics dyed in colors once reserved for ritual elites. Beauty became a value in itself. With material needs increasingly met, attention turned inward, to thought, to memory, to meaning. Knowledge flourished as never before. Scribes and scholars gathered in temples and palaces, recording laws, transactions, myths, and histories. Writing systems expanded from simple records into tools of expression. Stories once passed orally were preserved, standardized, and refined. Poetry emerged, celebrating gods, kings, love, and loss. Words gained permanence. Mathematics advanced alongside administration. Counting surplus led to calculation. Calculation led to geometry, measurement, and prediction. Builders used numbers to perfect proportions. Astronomers mapped the heavens with increasing precision, linking celestial cycles to calendars, agriculture, and ritual. The sky became a book to be read. Medicine grew from trial and tradition into early science. Healers cataloged plants, treatments, and symptoms. Though illness was still often attributed to divine displeasure, observation began to matter. Experience was recorded. Knowledge accumulated, rather than vanishing with each generation. Learning became inheritance. Centers of study emerged, libraries, schools, temple archives, where knowledge was gathered and guarded. Scholars debated ideas, refining understanding through argument rather than revelation alone. While faith still guided belief, reason found its place beside it. This balance defined the Golden Age. Art flourished in every form. Sculptors captured idealized human figures, blending realism with symbolism. Painters covered walls with scenes of daily life, ritual, and myth, preserving moments both ordinary and sacred. Music evolved beyond ceremony into entertainment, its rhythms echoing through festivals and private gatherings alike. Culture became shared identity. Festivals filled calendars. Public celebrations honored gods, harvests, victories, and seasonal cycles. Streets overflowed with color, sound, and movement. For a time, divisions of class softened beneath collective joy. The people laughed together, danced together, and believed, if only briefly, that prosperity was endless. The rulers understood the power of this joy. They sponsored art, funded construction, and patronized scholars. Cultural brilliance reflected favorably upon the throne. A prosperous, enlightened civilization legitimized authority better than fear alone ever could. Power dressed itself in refinement. Diplomacy replaced constant warfare. Envoys exchanged gifts rather than threats. Alliances were sealed through marriage and trade. Conflict did not vanish, but it became calculated, restrained by the understanding that stability benefited all. Peace fed progress. Urban life transformed. Cities expanded with planned districts for craftsmen, merchants, and administrators. Public spaces encouraged interaction. Baths, gardens, and gathering halls reflected a belief that life should be lived well, not merely endured. For the first time, leisure existed. Not for all. Laborers still toiled and inequality remained. But for many, time could be spent learning, creating, and enjoying. This shift altered how people viewed themselves. Identity expanded beyond occupation or obedience. Individuals mattered. Philosophical thought emerged quietly, often disguised within religious or moral teachings. Questions arose. What is justice? What makes a good life? What do humans owe one another, beyond law and ritual? These ideas did not challenge authority directly, but they planted seeds of introspection. The civilization began to think about itself. Education spread beyond elites. Apprentices learned trades through structured training. Literacy, while limited, expanded enough to influence commerce and culture. Knowledge was no longer entirely hidden behind temple walls. Still, access remained unequal. Wealth concentrated in cities and among elites. Rural communities benefited less from cultural brilliance. Slavery and forced labor persisted, supporting prosperity at great human cost. The Golden Age shone brightly, but not evenly. Yet even those at the margins felt its influence. Stories traveled, artifacts circulated. Ideals reached beyond walls and palaces. The belief that civilization had achieved something extraordinary took root across society. This belief became pride. The people compared themselves favorably to others. Foreigners were admired, but also seen as lesser, less refined. Superiority crept quietly into identity, reinforcing unity while planting seeds of future arrogance. Time, for a while, seemed kind. Generations grew up knowing abundance as normal. The hardships of earlier eras faded into legend. The struggle to survive was replaced by the challenge to excel. But golden ages are fragile. Prosperity bred complacency. Surplus encouraged excess. Art sometimes served vanity rather than meaning. Knowledge accumulated faster than wisdom. Inequality deepened beneath polished surfaces. The people did not notice these changes at first. They were too busy celebrating achievement, too confident in permanence. The monuments still stood. The granaries were full. The gods appeared pleased. Yet history rarely announces its turning points. For now, this was the height of civilization, a moment when wealth flowed, knowledge expanded, and culture reached extraordinary brilliance. It was an age remembered long after its end, idealized by descendants who would look back and wonder how such greatness could ever fade. In this moment, civilization believed it had mastered not just land and stone, but destiny itself. The sun shone brightly over cities of learning and beauty, and no one yet sensed how slowly the shadows were beginning to grow. Prosperity does not remain contained. When fields are full, cities rich, and confidence high, a civilization begins to look outward, not with curiosity alone, but with desire. The Golden Age had brought wealth and knowledge, but it also revealed limits. Borders felt narrow, resources beyond the horizon beckoned. Neighbors who once seemed distant now appeared weak, disorganized, or enviably rich. The same ambition that raised monuments and funded art now turned toward conquest. War, once defensive and desperate, became deliberate. The first campaigns were justified as necessity. Border raids were punished. Trade routes were secured. Tributary states were protected. Each conflict was framed as preservation rather than aggression. The people accepted this logic easily. Victory brought security. Security brought wealth. And wealth silenced doubt. The army transformed from a temporary force into a permanent institution. No longer composed only of farmers turned fighters, it became a profession. Soldiers trained year-round, drilled in formation, discipline, and loyalty. Weapons improved, stronger metals, standardized designs, specialized tools of killing. War became organized. Ranks replaced tribal bonds. Command structures mirrored civil administration. Orders flowed from the throne through generals to captains and soldiers. Obedience was absolute. Discipline was harsh. Desertion was punished not as fear, but as betrayal. The warrior's identity changed. To fight was no longer merely to defend home and family. It was to serve the state. Soldiers wore the symbols of the civilization, marched beneath banners, and fought for ideals taught since childhood: glory, honor, divine favor. Victory was sacred. Campaigns pushed outward along rivers, roads, and coastlines. Each successful conquest fed the next. Defeated cities were looted. their wealth absorbed. Survivors were enslaved, relocated, or taxed. Some regions resisted fiercely, others surrendered quickly, recognizing the futility of defiance. Expansion gained momentum. The throne embraced imperial ambition. Conquest was no longer episodic, it was policy. New lands meant new resources, new labor, and new prestige. Rulers styled themselves not just kings, but lords of many peoples, chosen by the gods to bring order to the world. Empire became destiny. Warriors were celebrated in art and song. Reliefs depicted triumphs. Statues honored generals. Young boys dreamed of glory on distant battlefields. Even those who never fought felt pride in victory. Yet war reshaped society profoundly. Resources flowed increasingly toward the military. Taxes funded campaigns. Labor built roads for armies rather than markets. Innovation favored weapons and logistics. The state grew more centralized, more demanding. Peace became temporary. The conquered lands posed new challenges. Diverse peoples spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and followed unfamiliar customs. Governing them required force or assimilation. Imperial administration expanded. Garrisons were stationed in foreign cities. Governors enforced law and tribute. Local elites were co-opted or replaced. Some regions prospered under new stability. Others suffered exploitation and resentment. Rebellion became constant threat. Armies that once marched outward now turned inward, suppressing revolts. Soldiers learned that conquest did not end conflict. It multiplied it. Still, the empire grew. Borders stretched farther than any could have imagined in earlier ages. Maps were redrawn. The civilization now defined itself not by shared origin, but by dominance. Identity shifted from who we are to what we control. This shift carried cost. Soldiers spent years away from home. Families fractured, veterans returned hardened, sometimes alienated from civilian life. Violence seeped into culture, normalizing cruelty as necessity. The gods were invoked constantly. Victories proved divine favor. Defeats demanded sacrifice. Temples overflowed with offerings before campaigns. Priests blessed weapons and banners, assuring soldiers that death in service guaranteed honor, perhaps even immortality. Faith and war intertwined, yet cracks formed beneath triumph. The farther armies marched, the harder supply became. Campaigns drained treasuries. New enemies learned tactics, adapted weapons, resisted more effectively. Victory demanded ever greater force. Empire fed on itself. Some generals grew powerful enough to rival kings. Loyalty shifted from throne to commander. Soldiers followed those who led them to victory and spoils, not those who ruled from distant palaces. The seeds of internal conflict were planted on foreign soil. Still, the dream endured. Rulers envisioned a world unified under their rule, a single order, a single peace enforced by strength. They imagined history would remember them as bringers of civilization, not conquerors. But empires are built on contradiction. They promise order through violence, unity through domination, peace through perpetual war. For a time, these contradictions are masked by success. For a time, the banners keep advancing. Warriors marched believing they were expanding greatness. Cities fell believing resistance was futile. The empire stood vast and powerful, its reach unprecedented. Yet every conquest stretched it thinner, and though few yet sensed it, the same armies that built the empire would one day decide its fate. For now, the imperial dream burned bright, fueled by ambition, carried by warriors, and sanctified by victory. The world trembled beneath marching feet, and civilization stood at the height of its power, blind to how close it had come to the edge. While emperors dreamed of conquest and priests read omens in the sky, the empire was held together by quieter lives, lived far from palaces and battlefields, shaped by routine, hardship, and endurance. For the common people, empire was not an idea. It was a weight. Most rose before the sun. Dawn was not a symbol of hope or renewal, but a signal to begin labor, before heat and exhaustion took their toll. Farmers stepped into fields their families had worked for generations, soil pressed hard by seasons of planting and harvest. Craftsmen opened workshops thick with dust and smoke. Laborers gathered at work sites, waiting to be assigned tasks that would leave their bodies aching by nightfall. Life revolved around necessity. Food was the center of existence. Every household measured time by meals, how much grain remained, how many mouths needed feeding, how long before the next harvest. A poor yield meant hunger. A failed season meant desperation. Though the empire boasted overflowing granaries, access was uneven. Surplus flowed upward toward cities, temples, and armies. The people survived on what remained. Taxes were constant. Grain, livestock, labor, and coin were demanded with little regard for circumstance. Officials recorded quotas meticulously, enforcing them with punishments that rarely distinguished inability from defiance. To fall behind was dangerous. Debt followed quickly, and debt led to loss of land, of freedom, sometimes of family. Many became bound laborers. Some sold themselves temporarily to survive a bad year. Others were forced into service after failing to meet obligations. Slavery, though varied in form, was a visible reality. Captives from conquest, debtors, criminals. They worked fields, quarries, and households, often unseen but essential. Freedom was fragile. Homes were modest. Mud brick walls, reed roofs, dirt floors. Families lived close together, sharing space with animals and tools. Privacy was rare, comfort was minimal. Yet within these homes, life persisted with quiet resilience. Families were everything. Parents taught children trades early. Childhood was brief, shaped by responsibility rather than play. Girls learned domestic labor, weaving, food preparation. Boys followed fathers into fields or workshops. Survival demanded contribution from all. Education was limited. Most never learned to read. Knowledge passed through observation, repetition, and story. Oral tradition carried history, belief, and instruction. Elders remembered better times or worse ones and warned younger generations accordingly. Faith offered solace. Shrines stood in neighborhoods and crossroads. Simple offerings, bread, oil, whispered prayers were given in hope of protection. The gods felt closer here than in grand temples. People prayed for rain, health, and mercy, not empire. Festivals brought rare relief. On sacred days, labor paused. Streets filled with color, music, and movement. Food was shared, stories were told. For a brief time, hierarchy softened, and joy felt communal. These moments mattered deeply. They reminded people that life was more than endurance. But festivals ended. Illness was constant threat. Without understanding of disease, outbreaks spread quickly. Healers offered remedies of herbs and ritual, sometimes helping, often not. Death was common enough to feel expected, but never painless. Women bore heavy burdens. They worked long hours, raised children, managed households, and often labored alongside men. Their status depended on family and fertility. Widowhood was dangerous. Childbirth was perilous. Yet women held communities together through care, memory, and quiet strength. The empire rarely acknowledged them. Markets were centers of life and anxiety. Prices fluctuated. Officials monitored trade. Rumors traveled faster than goods. News of war, tax changes, distant rebellions. The common people experienced empire through these rumors, through sudden demands and shifting rules. War touched them indirectly, but relentlessly. Young men were conscripted. Some never returned, others came back changed. Fields went untended during campaigns. Families absorbed loss silently. Victories celebrated by elites often meant only grief for those left behind. Justice felt distant. Courts favored wealth and status. Officials could be bribed. Punishments were swift and harsh for the powerless. Many learned to avoid attention, to endure injustice rather than challenge it. Resistance existed, but quietly. People resisted through evasion, slow labor, hidden grain, whispered complaints. Rarely did open rebellion arise from common folk alone. It required leaders, organization, and desperation. More often, survival meant adaptation. Despite hardship, culture endured. Songs were sung while working. Stories were told at night. Humor surveyed even cruelty. Love, friendship, and hope persisted in small, stubborn ways. The people did not see themselves as shaping history. They did not dream of monuments or conquest. Their victories were private. A healthy child, a full harvest, a peaceful year. These small triumphs sustained the empire far more than any army, yet they remained invisible. Official records counted them as numbers. Tax units, labor quotas, conscripts. Their voices rarely reached the throne. Their struggles were absorbed silently into the foundation of power. The empire stood tall because they endured, and as long as they believed endurance was possible, civilization continued. But beneath the surface of daily life, beneath routine and resignation, lay exhaustion. Generations carried burdens without relief. Inequality deepened. Faith strained under unanswered prayers. The common people did not yet rebel, but they were tired. And empires, no matter how vast, ultimately depend on the strength of those who rise each morning, work until dusk, and ask for little more than the chance to survive another day. When that chance disappears, even the quietest lives can change history. When survival no longer consumed every waking moment, the mind began to wander. It wandered beyond fields and walls, beyond gods and kings, beyond the immediate demands of hunger and labor. In that wandering, civilization discovered something quieter than power and more enduring than conquest: the pursuit of understanding. Wisdom did not announce itself with armies or monuments. It emerged in silence, in shaded courtyards, candle-lit rooms, and patient observation of the world as it was. The first scholars were not revolutionaries. They were record-keepers, priests, healers, and artisans whose work demanded precision. Yet within their tasks lay questions that could not be ignored. Why did stars return to the same positions? Why did some plants heal and others kill? Why did societies flourish, and why did they fail? To ask such questions was dangerous. In a world governed by divine authority, curiosity had limits. The gods explained much, and tradition explained the rest. But experience did not always align with belief. Patterns emerged that ritual alone could not fully explain. Knowledge began to separate from myth. Writing was the great catalyst. At first it was utilitarian. Marks on clay, scratches on bone, symbols pressed into soft surfaces to count grain or record debts. These early scripts were narrow in purpose, rigid in form. But once the idea took hold that thought could be preserved beyond memory, everything changed. Words outlived voices. Scribes became the guardians of permanence. They copied laws, myths, treaties, and genealogies. Over time, they recorded observations, experiments, and reflections. Writing allowed knowledge to accumulate, instead of vanish with each generation. Memory became collective. Libraries and archives emerged, not open to all, but vital nonetheless. Within their walls, the civilization stored its understanding of itself and the world. To read was to converse with the dead. To write was to speak to the unborn. Science grew quietly, disguised as practice. Astronomy was among the earliest disciplines to flourish. Farmers depended on the sky. Priests tracked celestial movements to time rituals. Over centuries, careful observation revealed cycles, predictable, reliable, measurable. The heavens were no longer chaotic expressions of divine whim. They followed order. This realization was profound. If the sky obeyed patterns, perhaps the world did too. Mathematics followed necessity. Measurement was required for land, construction, and trade. From counting came calculation. From calculation came abstraction. Numbers became tools not just for accounting, but for understanding relationships between shape and space, weight and balance, time and motion. Builders trusted numbers as much as prayer. Medicine evolved through trial, error, and memory. Healers recorded symptoms and treatments, noting what worked and what failed. While illness was still attributed to spiritual causes, observation slowly reshaped practice. Knowledge passed from master to apprentice, refined by experience. Some truths were learned painfully. Anatomy remained limited by taboo, but injury and warfare revealed the body's fragility and resilience. Wounds taught lessons. Survival taught caution. Healing became an art balanced between ritual and reason. Art flourished alongside knowledge. Freed from constant struggle, artisans explored beauty for its own sake. Sculpture sought ideal form. Painting captured movement, emotion, and narrative. Music experimented with rhythm and harmony. Art was no longer solely sacred or political. It became expressive. Human experience became worthy of depiction. Artists studied proportion, symmetry, and perspective. They observed nature closely, translating life into stone, pigment, and sound. Through their work, they preserved moments otherwise lost: laughter, grief, labor, love. Art became memory made visible. Philosophy emerged not as rebellion, but as reflection. Thinkers gathered, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly, to discuss ethics, justice, truth, and the nature of existence. These discussions were framed carefully, often couched in allegory or moral instruction, to avoid conflict with religious authority. Questions multiplied. What makes a ruler just? Is obedience a virtue or a necessity? Do the gods reward the righteous or the powerful? What is a good life? There were no final answers. Philosophy did not replace belief. It complicated it. Thinkers sought harmony between divine order and human reason. Some argued that wisdom was obedience to tradition. Others believed wisdom lay in understanding nature and oneself. Disagreement became productive. Debate sharpened thought. Schools of ideas formed, not formal institutions but circles of influence. Students followed teachers not by decree, but by persuasion. Ideas spread slowly, carried by conversation and writing rather than law. Education expanded cautiously. While literacy remained limited, apprenticeships flourished. Knowledge of craft, science, and art passed systematically. Skill was respected. Mastery earned status. Learning was no longer confined entirely to temples and palaces. The mind gained value. Yet wisdom had boundaries. Too much questioning threatened order. Scholars who challenged sacred narratives too openly risked punishment or exile. Innovation was tolerated when it served stability, but feared when it questioned authority. Knowledge walked a careful path. Still, the legacy of this era was profound. Civilization had begun to think critically, to observe systematically, and to preserve ideas beyond individual lives. These voices of wisdom did not shout. They whispered, but their whispers carried across centuries. Even rulers listened. Some kings patronized scholars and artists, seeking legitimacy through enlightenment. They built libraries, commissioned works, and consulted thinkers on law and governance. Wisdom became another instrument of power, but also a quiet check upon it. The people benefited indirectly. Calendars improved harvests. Engineering advanced infrastructure. Art enriched daily life. Philosophy influenced moral teaching. Though most never read scholarly texts, they lived within a culture shaped by them. Civilization became self-aware. It no longer merely existed. It reflected on existence. It questioned purpose, meaning, and destiny. This self-awareness marked a turning point, as significant as any conquest or monument. Yet wisdom could not halt decline. Knowledge does not prevent arrogance. Art does not erase inequality. Philosophy does not feed the hungry. The voices of wisdom offered clarity, but not control. Still, when the empire would one day falter, it was these voices that would endure. Long after walls crumbled and armies vanished, the ideas born in this era would survive, copied, studied, reinterpreted by distant generations. Empires fall, but wisdom, once spoken and preserved, has a way of refusing silence. And in that refusal, civilization finds its truest immortality. No civilization collapses suddenly. Long before walls fall or enemies march through broken gates, decline begins quietly, hidden beneath routine, masked by ceremony, ignored by those who benefit most from the existing order. In this empire, the signs were subtle at first, dismissed as temporary troubles in an otherwise eternal system. But stone, no matter how strong, always cracks under uneven weight. The first fractures appeared at the top. Power, once a burden carried cautiously by early kings, had become an inheritance. Rulers were born into authority rather than tested by it. Court life grew insulated from the realities of the people. Decisions were made in halls far removed from fields and workshops, shaped more by ambition and rivalry than necessity. Corruption did not arrive as a scandal. It arrived as convenience. Officials accepted gifts in exchange for favors. Taxes were adjusted quietly for friends. Laws were enforced selectively. None of this felt revolutionary. Each act seemed small, justified, even practical. Over time, these small acts formed a system, one that rewarded loyalty over competence and wealth over justice. The law remained unchanged in stone. Its application did not. Those with influence navigated the system easily. Those without learned that fairness was an illusion. Justice, once predictable, if harsh, became arbitrary. Trust eroded not in dramatic rebellion, but in silent resignation. Inequality deepened. The Golden Age had created wealth, but it had not distributed it evenly. As trade expanded and empire grew, riches concentrated in cities, temples, and elite households. Estates expanded while small farms shrank. Debt bound families to servitude. Slavery increased, fed by conquest and poverty alike. Prosperity became a spectacle rather than a shared experience. In cities, luxury flourished. Palaces glittered with imported stone and metal. Banquets overloaded with food most would never taste. Art celebrated abundance and victory. Meanwhile, in crowded neighborhoods and rural villages, survival grew harder. The gap widened quietly, but relentlessly. The common people noticed. They noticed when taxes rose during poor harvests. They noticed when officials lived well while demanding sacrifice. They noticed when military victories brought no relief, only new levies. They noticed when appeals went unheard unless accompanied by payment. Resentment grew, not loud enough to alarm the throne, but deep enough to weaken loyalty. Internal strife followed inequality naturally. As wealth concentrated, power did too. Rival factions emerged within the ruling class. Nobles, priests, generals, administrators, each competing for influence. The unity that had once sustained expansion fractured into intrigue. The palace became a battlefield without weapons. Plots replaced open conflict. Alliances shifted. Accusations flew. Officials were removed not for failure, but for threatening others' ambitions. Policy became inconsistent, shaped by short-term advantage rather than long-term stability. Governance grew erratic. Provincial administrators exploited confusion. Some ruled harshly to extract wealth quickly. Others ignored orders entirely, building local power bases. Communication slowed. Authority weakened at the edges where empire had once expanded most aggressively. The center still believed it was strong. The army, once disciplined and unified, felt the strain as well. Soldiers saw rewards diminish as campaigns dragged on. Veterans returned to find land seized or taxes unbearable. Loyalty to commanders began to outweigh loyalty to the state. Military power turned inward. When disputes erupted, rulers relied on force rather than reform. Troops suppressed unrest. Demonstrations were crushed. Punishments became more public, more brutal, not to restore justice, but to instill fear. Fear worked briefly, but fear does not rebuild trust. Religion, once a source of unity, became another arena of conflict. Temples amassed enormous wealth while preaching sacrifice. Priests competed for influence. Some aligned openly with factions at court. Faith grew entangled with politics, weakening its moral authority. People still prayed, but with doubt. Old myths rang hollow when suffering persisted without explanation. Rituals felt repetitive rather than reassuring. The gods seemed distant or selective in their favor. Philosophers and thinkers sensed the shift. Some wrote cautiously about justice and decay, disguising criticism as moral instruction. Others withdrew into silence. A few spoke too boldly and vanished. Wisdom no longer guided power. It circled it warily. Culture reflected anxiety. Art grew darker, more nostalgic. Stories idealized the past. Mourning lost virtue. Monuments grew larger but less inspired, symbols of insecurity rather than confidence. The empire still looked magnificent. But beneath the surface, its foundation was weakening. Economic strain spread. Trade routes became less reliable. Corruption disrupted markets. Inflation eroded savings. Scarcity returned, not as famine, but as constant uncertainty. People adapted, but adaptation had limits. Small rebellions flared in distant provinces. Most were crushed quickly, dismissed as isolated disturbances. Yet each revolt revealed the same truth. Loyalty was no longer automatic. The empire responded with denial. Rulers blamed external enemies, disloyal subjects, divine displeasure, anything but themselves. Reforms were announced, rarely enforced. Grand projects distracted from systemic problems. Spectacle replaced substance. The cracks widened. What made this period most dangerous was not suffering, but normalization. Corruption felt ordinary, inequality felt inevitable, strife felt permanent. People adjusted expectations downward, accepting less from leaders and more from themselves. This acceptance was fatal. Civilization does not fall when people suffer. It falls when they stop believing improvement is possible. By the time the rulers noticed the depth of discontent, it was too late to reverse easily. Trust, once broken, could not be commanded back into existence. Authority remained, but legitimacy faded. The foundation still stood, but it was fractured, uneven, and strained by the weight of empire. And, though the walls had not yet fallen, the future of the civilization was no longer secure. The cracks were spreading. All that remained was the moment when pressure would finally break the stone. Empires rarely fall to a single blow. They are worn down, slowly, relentlessly, by pressures that never fully retreat. For this civilization, those pressures now gathered beyond its borders, waiting, watching, testing for weakness. The empire's expansion had reshaped the world around it. Neighboring peoples had been conquered, taxed, displaced, or humiliated. Some were absorbed and reshaped by imperial order. Others survived at the edges, watching, remembering, adapting. They learned the empire's tactics, studied its weapons, memorized its roads and weaknesses. The empire had taught them how to fight it. At first, foreign threats came as raids. Small, fast, disruptive. Border villages burned, livestock stolen, watchtowers tested. These attacks were not meant to conquer, only to probe. Each raid asked the same question: how strong are you now? The answers were troubling. Garrisons were undermanned. Supplies arrived late. Commanders argued over authority. Once impenetrable borders now relied on reputation rather than readiness. Reputation fades quickly. Soon, raids became invasions. Confederations of tribes formed beyond the frontier, united not by culture but by shared resentment and opportunity. Nomadic warriors struck with speed the empire struggled to match. Coastal enemies arrived by sea, bypassing land defenses entirely. Old rivals returned with renewed strength. The empire faced threats on every horizon. Wars multiplied, not sequentially but simultaneously. Armies were divided. Generals argued over priorities. Resources stretched thin. Victories in one region were offset by defeats in another. Endless war became the new normal. For the people, this meant constant anxiety. News of distant battles traveled slowly, distorted by rumor. Each message carried fear: another tax, another levy, another son taken to fight. The empire no longer chose war. War chose the empire. Defensive campaigns drained treasuries faster than conquests had ever filled them. Fortifications required constant repair. Mercenaries were hired to compensate for manpower shortages, their loyalty measured in payment rather than allegiance. Trust eroded further. Soldiers fought bravely, but exhaustion showed. Veterans marched again and again without rest. New recruits lacked training. Discipline weakened, desertion increased, especially when defeat seemed inevitable. The army still existed, but its spirit was fading. Foreign enemies sensed this. They no longer feared the empire's name. They spoke of its corruption, its divided leadership, its exhausted people. Some claimed divine signs foretold its fall. Others simply followed opportunity. Sieges grew longer and more brutal. Cities once confident in their walls now waited in dread as enemies encircled them. Supplies dwindled, disease spread, hunger turned neighbors against one another. When walls fell, mercy was rare. The empire could not protect everyone. Each lost city sent shockwaves through the realm. Refugees flooded safer regions, straining resources and spreading panic. Stories of slaughter and destruction eroded morale faster than any defeat. Faith wavered. The gods who once guaranteed victory now seemed silent. Rituals intensified. More sacrifices, more prayers. But outcomes did not improve. Some whispered that the empire had lost divine favor. Others claimed the gods themselves were divided. Religion no longer unified. It fractured. At court, blame replaced strategy. Generals accused administrators of failure. Officials accused commanders of incompetence. Rulers accused subjects of disloyalty. No one accepted responsibility. Decisions came too late, or contradicted one another. Some argued for reform and diplomacy. Others demanded harsher control and total war. The result was paralysis. The empire reacted instead of planning, surveying instead of governing. Foreign powers exploited this confusion. Former allies switched sides. Tributary states rebelled, sensing weakness. Enemies coordinated attacks, striking supply lines and isolating strongholds. The empire shrank, not officially, but effectively. Borders existed on maps long after they were lost in reality. Authority faded beyond major cities. Local leaders made their own deals with invaders, choosing survival over loyalty. This was not treason. It was desperation. War transformed daily life, even where battles were distant. Prices soared. Trade collapsed. Infrastructure decayed as resources flowed to the front. Crime increased. Trust disappeared. Children grew up knowing only conflict. An entire generation was shaped by fear, loss, and instability. For them, the empire was not a source of pride. It was a burden they had inherited, without choice. Still, resistance persisted. Some cities fought desperately or defending walls with courage born of necessity. Some commanders achieved brilliant victories, briefly restoring hope. But these moments were isolated, unable to reverse systemic decline. The wars did not end. Each victory led to another threat. Each defeat weakened the empire further. The cycle fed itself. Violence breeding violence. Fear breeding cruelty. Foreign enemies no longer needed to defeat the empire outright. They only needed to wait. Wait for exhaustion. Wait for division. Wait for collapse from within. The gates still stood. The banners still flew, but the empire was no longer at war to expand or even to defend its greatness. It fought now simply to exist. One season, one city, one fragile moment at a time. And as enemies gathered closer, the people began to sense a truth long avoided. The greatest threat to the empire was no longer beyond the walls. It was the endless war itself, slowly grinding civilization into dust. Even as enemies battered the borders and wars drained the heart of the empire, a greater adversary rose, one that could not be fought, negotiated with, or conquered. Nature, long treated as subdued, returned to remind civilization of its limits. For generations, the people had believed they understood the land. Rivers were guided through canals. Floods were predicted. Harvests followed calendars shaped by centuries of observation. The empire had come to see nature not as a master, but as a system, one that could be managed through knowledge, labor, and ritual. That belief was about to be tested. The first signs were subtle. Floods arrived early one year, then too late the next. Rains fell unevenly, soaking some regions while leaving others cracked and barren. Winters lingered longer than expected. Summers grew harsher, scorching crops before they could mature. At first, these changes were dismissed as coincidence. Officials blamed local mismanagement, priests blamed insufficient devotion, farmers blamed themselves. The empire had weathered poor seasons before. This too would pass. It did not. The rivers, once the lifeblood of civilization, became unpredictable. Some swelled beyond control, breaking levees and drowning fields. Others shrank to trickles, exposing cracked riverbeds where boats once passed freely. Irrigation networks designed for stable patterns failed under extremes. The land grew unreliable, harvests suffered, grain yields dropped sharply in several regions at once, overwhelming the empire's ability to compensate. Granaries emptied faster than they could be refilled. Reserves meant for emergencies were consumed quickly by war and corruption. Hunger returned. At first, it crept quietly. Meals grew smaller. Families mixed grain with husks and roots. Livestock were slaughtered early. Children complained of fatigue. Elders weakened. Soon, hunger became visible. Markets emptied. Prices soared beyond reach. Bread became scarce. Starvation spread unevenly, striking the poorest first, then creeping upward through society. Famine stripped away illusion. The empire's promises of stability rang hollow when people starved beneath its rule. Taxes were still demanded. Armies were still fed. Temples still received offerings. For the common people, this imbalance felt like betrayal. Desperation bred unrest. The climate continued to worsen. Extended droughts hardened soil beyond recovery. Sudden storms destroyed what little remained. Pests thrived in unstable conditions, devouring weakened crops. Disease followed malnutrition, turning hunger into death. Entire villages vanished. Some people fled toward cities, believing walls and authority offered protection. Instead, they found overcrowding, disease, and competition for dwindling resources. Refugees slept in streets and fields. Crime increased, order frayed. The city, once symbol of security, became a pressure point. Rulers responded with familiar tools, ritual and command. Priests declared days of fasting and sacrifice. Processions filled streets with prayer. Offerings increased, sometimes cruelly extracted from the starving. The gods were begged, appeased, threatened. Nature did not respond. Officials enforced rationing, often ineffectively. Corruption flourished amid scarcity. Grain disappeared into private stores. Black markets thrived. Those with wealth survived. Those without did not. Inequality became lethal. Faith fractured under strain. Some clung desperately to belief, convinced suffering was punishment for moral failure. Others abandoned the gods entirely, cursing powers that demanded devotion but offered no mercy. Old myths lost comfort. People began to speak of omens, darkened suns, strange winds, animals behaving erratically. Whether real or imagined, these signs fed panic. The sense grew that the world itself was turning hostile. Climate no longer felt cyclical, it felt broken. The empire's infrastructure failed under stress. Canals silted when maintenance lapsed. Roads crumbled as labor disappeared. Flood defenses collapsed. Each failure compounded the next, accelerating decline. Nature exploited weakness. War worsened everything. Armies marching through fragile regions consumed scarce supplies, trampled fields, and displaced communities. Soldiers starved alongside civilians. Discipline collapsed. Raiding replaced supply. Violence spread inward. The empire devoured itself. Attempts at reform came too late. Emergency decrees redistributed grain unevenly. Some regions were saved, others were abandoned. Rulers prioritized politically vital areas, leaving peripheries to collapse. This choice haunted them. Famine eroded loyalty faster than defeat ever could. People no longer blamed foreign enemies or distant rulers. They blamed the system that could not protect them from hunger. Rebellion flared in desperate regions, not ideological, not organized. Simply the refusal to starve quietly. Granaries were raided. Officials were attacked. Order disintegrated where hunger ruled. Nature had stripped authority of legitimacy. The psychological toll was immense. Parents watched children waste away. Communities turned inward, hoarding and mistrusting neighbors. Compassion faded as survival instincts sharpened. Civilization's moral fabric tore. Even the elite felt fear. Wealth delayed hunger but did not eliminate anxiety. Palaces fortified their stores. Guards increased. Feasts continued behind closed doors, fueling resentment beyond the walls. Isolation replaced confidence. Climate instability persisted year after year. There was no return to normal. The people realized, slowly, painfully, that the old patterns were gone. The land they had mastered no longer behaved as expected. The future became unknowable. In this uncertainty, superstition flourished. Prophets arose, preaching doom or salvation. Some promised renewal through radical devotion. Others called for rejection of old gods entirely. Society fractured further. Nature had done what armies could not. It bypassed walls, ignored hierarchies, and humbled power indiscriminately. It exposed the empire's dependence on fragile systems and predictable cycles. Without abundance, everything else failed. Famine weakened bodies. Climate instability shattered planning. Uncontrollable forces revealed that no amount of stone, law, or belief could guarantee control. The empire still stood, but it stood on exhausted land, starving people, and broken certainty. And as the people looked to the sky, once a source of guidance, they no longer saw order. They saw indifference. Nature had not turned against civilization. It had simply reminded it of the truth it had long forgotten. No empire rules the earth. The earth merely allows them to exist, until it does not. By the time the last rulers came to power, the empire was already tired. Its walls still stood, its banners still flew, its titles still carried ancient authority. But beneath the surface, exhaustion had seeped into every layer of society. What earlier generations had built with confidence, these rulers inherited with fear. They did not ascend to greatness. They climbed onto a throne already sinking. The crown had become a burden. Gone were the days when rulers spoke of destiny and expansion. The language of the court shifted from ambition to survival. Councils met not to plan the future, but to contain disaster. Each decision was reactive, shaped by crisis rather than vision. The last rulers ruled an empire in retreat. They inherited empty granaries, overstretched armies, broken infrastructure, and a population that no longer trusted promises. The rituals of power continued. Coronations, proclamations, festivals, but they felt hollow, echoes of confidence rather than expressions of it. Authority remained. Legitimacy did not. Some rulers recognized the danger immediately. They spoke of reform, moderation, and renewal. Advisors urged change. Fairer taxation, reduced military campaigns, restored local autonomy, relief for the starving. These ideas were not new. What was new was urgency. But urgency does not create unity. Every reform threatened someone's power. Reducing taxes angered elites who benefited from the system. Cutting military spending alarmed generals. Challenging temple wealth provoked priests. Each attempt at change triggered resistance from those who still prospered amid decline. The empire resisted its own salvation. The last rulers found themselves trapped between necessity and survival. To reform too deeply risked rebellion from the powerful. To reform too little ensured collapse. Most chose compromise. Small changes announced loudly, enforced weakly. Reforms became theater. Edicts were carved and proclaimed, but local officials ignored them. Corruption continued behind closed doors. Resources meant for relief vanished before reaching the people. The gap between intention and reality widened. The people noticed. They had heard promises before. Each failed reform deepened cynicism. Hope eroded faster than food supplies. When rulers spoke of patience and sacrifice, the words sounded like mockery to those who had sacrificed for generations. Desperation shaped policy. Some rulers turned to repression. Protests were crushed. Dissent was punished. Surveillance increased. Fear became the last remaining tool of control. For a time, it worked. Order returned superficially. Silence spread. But silence is not stability. Other rulers turned to spectacle. Grand projects were announced to inspire confidence. New monuments, restored temples, lavish ceremonies meant to remind the people of former glory. These displays drained resources and achieved little beyond resentment. Stone could not feed the hungry. Foreign pressure intensified as internal weakness became obvious. Border defenses failed. Allies defected. Diplomacy grew desperate. Tribute was offered, where commands once sufficed. The empire negotiated from weakness, not strength. The throne felt smaller with each concession. Succession worsened instability. Short reigns followed one another rapidly. Some rulers were competent but lacked time. Others were inexperienced, chosen by faction rather than merit. Court intrigue determined leadership more often than ability. Power became fragile. Generals held real authority in many regions. Governors acted independently. The empire fractured administratively long before it fractured politically. Unity existed in name only. The army, once loyal to the state, now followed individuals. Soldiers demanded payment they rarely received. Discipline collapsed. Desertion rose. Some units turned to banditry. Others pledged allegiance to whoever could sustain them. The sword no longer belonged to the crown. The last rulers understood this danger, but lacked the means to fix it. Reforming the army required resources and trust. Neither existed. Faith offered no refuge. The gods had been invoked endlessly, through famine, war, and disaster, without relief. Priests struggled to explain continued suffering. New cults emerged, promising salvation or destruction. Religious unity shattered. The ruler was no longer seen as divinely favored. This loss was catastrophic. Once, belief had bound society together, even in hardship. Now, hardship stood alone. Authority was questioned openly. Blame spread upward. The ruler became a symbol, not of order, but of failure. Some last rulers tried humility. They reduced court luxury. appeared publicly among the people, acknowledged suffering. These gestures earned brief admiration, but could not reverse structural collapse. Compassion without capacity was not enough. Others tried denial. They insisted the empire remained strong, that enemies exaggerated weakness, that suffering was temporary. These lies comforted no one. Reality contradicted them daily. Time ran out. Each year brought fewer options. Infrastructure decayed beyond repair. Trade routes collapsed. Provinces drifted away. The empire shrank in practice, even if not yet in name. The last rulers ruled fragments. In their final years, desperation overtook dignity. Emergency decrees replaced law. Forced requisitions replaced taxation. Loyalty was bought or coerced. The ruler's voice carried fear instead of authority. The throne became isolated. Surrounded by guards cut off from truth, rulers relied on filtered information. Advisors spoke carefully. Bad news was softened or delayed. Decisions were made too late, based on incomplete understanding. The empire no longer understood itself. When rebellions erupted, they were no longer shocking. They were expected. Suppression followed reflexively, draining resources further. Each victory cost more than it gained. Collapse became cumulative. The last rulers were not monsters. Many were intelligent, well-intentioned, and painfully aware of their situation. But they were trapped within a system that had grown too rigid, too unequal, too exhausted to change. They inherited the consequences of centuries. Civilizations do not die because of a single bad ruler. They die when systems outgrow adaptability. These rulers arrived when adaptability was already gone. In the end, their failures were not dramatic. No single decree destroyed the empire. No single reform saved it. Decline was gradual, layered, inevitable. When the last ruler looked out from the palace, at thinning crowds, empty streets, guarded gates, they did not see an empire. They saw memory. Memory of what had been, of what should have been, of what could no longer be restored. The throne still stood, but it stood alone, unsupported by belief, weakened by reality, waiting for history to move on without it. The age of rulers was ending, and with it the civilization they had been powerless to save. The eternal city had been called many things across the centuries. Invincible, divinely protected, the heart of the world. Its walls had risen higher than memory. Its streets had echoed with triumph and ceremony, and its name had carried authority far beyond its gates. No one truly believed it could fall. Even as provinces broke away, as famine stalked the countryside, and as enemies pressed closer, the city endured. It had endured before. It always had. To imagine its end felt like imagining the end of the sun. And yet, the fall did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as silence. The city woke one morning to a strange stillness. Markets opened late. Temple bells rang weakly, if at all. Guards stood at gates with hollow eyes, their armor worn thin, their numbers reduced. Smoke from hearth fires rose unevenly, betraying neighborhoods already abandoned. Something fundamental had shifted. For months, years perhaps, the Eternal City had lived in a state of suspended crisis. Grain ships arrived sporadically. Refugees crowded outer districts. Officials argued endlessly. The ruler issued decrees that no longer mattered beyond the palace walls. Now even pretense was gone. The treasury was empty. What gold remained had been spent on mercenaries who had long since departed, unpaid and resentful. The army stationed in the city was a shadow of what it once had been, too few to defend walls built for legions. Beyond the gates, enemies waited. They were no longer a single force, but many. Foreign warriors, rebel factions, former allies turned opportunists. Some sought plunder, others sought revenge. A few believed they were instruments of destiny, sent to end a corrupt age. The Eternal City had become a prize too tempting to ignore. The first breach was not violent. It was administrative. Provincial commanders stopped sending reports. Governors ceased responding to summons. Trade routes failed entirely. The city no longer commanded. It merely existed, isolated in name and authority. Inside, order collapsed quietly. Food riots erupted in poorer districts. Not organized revolts. Simply hunger turned desperate. Storehouses were looted. Officials fled or hid. Temples closed their doors, guarding what wealth remained. Faith abandoned the streets. Fire followed hunger. Whether accidental or deliberate, flames spread through tightly packed neighborhoods. Without manpower or coordination, they burned unchecked. Smoke darkened the sky for days. Entire districts vanished, reduced to ash and memory. The eternal city began to eat itself. People fled in waves, those with means first, those with nothing last. Families packed what they could carry. Roads clogged with refugees seeking safety that no longer existed. Many died along the way of exposure, violence, or daer. The city bled its people. Within the palace, panic ruled. Advisors argued over escape or defense. Messengers brought conflicting reports, enemy movements, betrayals, rumors. The ruler, whoever now bore that title, faced the impossible choice between abandonment and annihilation. History would remember, neither kindly. Attempts at negotiation failed. Enemies smelled weakness. Terms demanded were absolute. Surrender, tribute, submission. Pride, even at the end, resisted. The gates remained closed. The siege, when it came, was brutal, but brief. There was no grand battle worthy of song. No heroic last stand of disciplined ranks. The walls were undermanned. Supplies were gone. Morale was shattered. When the gates fell, they fell inward. Invaders poured through streets once paved for processions. Looting began immediately. Palaces were stripped, temples were desecrated, statues were toppled, not always for hatred but for metal. Chaos consumed the eternal city. Some defenders fought desperately, protecting families rather than institutions. Others surrendered. Many simply hid. Law vanished. Authority meant nothing. The empire ended, not with ceremony, but with screams. Night fell under a sky lit by fire. The glow of burning buildings illuminated the silhouettes of towers that had once defined the horizon. Roofs collapsed. Columns cracked. The stone that had promised eternity broke under heat and neglect. The city that had ruled the world was reduced to sound and flame. By dawn, silence returned. It was the silence of aftermath, the kind that follows catastrophe, heavy and unnatural. Smoke drifted through ruined streets. Bodies lay unburied. Survivors moved slowly, stunned, unsure whether they were free or simply forgotten. The eternal city no longer existed. What remained was ruin. The palace stood damaged, looted, its halls empty. The throne, once sacred, sat overturned or abandoned, meaningless amid destruction. Records burned, archives lost, memory itself seemed wounded. Centuries of history vanished in days. Outside the city, the empire dissolved rapidly. Without a center, authority fractured entirely. Provinces declared independence. New powers rose on the ruins. Former subjects redefined themselves overnight. The empire did not fall everywhere at once. But without the eternal city, it no longer mattered. Those who survived carried fragments of the past with them. Stories, rituals, skills, beliefs. Civilization did not disappear entirely. It scattered. Some fled to rebuild elsewhere. Some adapted under new rulers. Some clung desperately to old identities long after they had meaning. But the age was over. Generations later, travelers would walk among the ruins. They would marvel at fallen columns and shattered walls, wondering how such greatness could have failed. Poets would write of hubris. Scholars would debate causes. Rulers would swear their own empires were different. They never were. The fall of the Eternal City was not merely the collapse of buildings or institutions. It was the end of a way of understanding the world, the belief that power, once achieved, could be permanent. Civilization had risen from soil and stone, from faith and ambition, and now it returned to them. The era ended not with a final proclamation, but with a whisper carried on the wind through broken streets. Nothing built by human hands is eternal. Only the memory remains. Civilizations do not truly die when their cities burn. They die only when they are forgotten. Long after the Eternal City fell into silence, long after weeds pushed through broken stone and wind erased the last traces of smoke, the world moved on. New powers rose where old banners once flew. New languages replaced ancient tongues. New gods were worshipped beneath different skies. Yet the fallen civilization did not vanish. It lingered. Its presence could be felt in the curve of roads that still followed ancient paths, in laws borrowed and reshaped by successor states, in stories told so often their origins were no longer remembered. Time buried the empire, but it did not erase it. The ruins became teachers. At first, survivors avoided them. Broken cities reminded people of loss, of hunger, of fear. They were haunted places, filled with ghosts both imagined and real. But necessity draws people back. Stone was reused. Foundations became shelters. Old walls marked boundaries for new lives. Civilization rebuilt itself on its own bones. Children born generations after the fall grew up among remnants of greatness without knowing their creators. They played beside fallen columns. They slept in houses built from ancient bricks. To them, the ruins were part of the natural world, like hills or rivers. But memory persisted in fragments. Elders told stories of a time when the world was united, when laws were strong, when roads reached the horizon. These stories grew exaggerated, softened by nostalgia, sharpened by regret. The fallen civilization became legend, both warning and ideal. History transformed into myth. Scholars came later. They dug where cities once stood, piecing together broken inscriptions and scattered artifacts. They studied writing half lost to time, reconstructing language from shards. Each discovery brought clarity and humility. The civilization had been more complex than legend suggested. It was not simply glorious nor merely corrupt. It was human, capable of brilliance and cruelty, wisdom and arrogance, cooperation and destruction. Its legacy was not purity or perfection, but possibility. The fallen empire became a mirror. New rulers studied its rise, hoping to imitate its success. They adopted its administrative systems, its legal principles, its architectural styles. They claimed descent from its authority, believing legitimacy could be inherited. They also studied its collapse, though less eagerly. The lessons were clear, though rarely heeded, that power without accountability rots from within. That inequality weakens unity. That endless war devours even the strongest states. That nature cannot be commanded forever. That belief must be earned, not demanded. These truths echoed across centuries, yet every new civilization believed itself immune. The fallen empire lived on in language. Words coined by its scribes survived in altered form, embedded in speech long after their meaning changed. Legal concepts persisted, ideas of justice, citizenship, obligation, passed down like heirlooms. Law remembered what memory forgot. Art endured as well. Fragments of sculpture inspired new styles. Patterns carved into stone were copied into wood and fabric. Music evolved from ancient rhythms. The human desire to create beauty outlived the empire that had nurtured it. Creativity was the truest inheritance. Knowledge survived unevenly. Some texts were lost forever, burned, forgotten, untranslated. Others were preserved by chance or care. carried across borders by scholars, traders, or refugees. These texts seeded future breakthroughs in science, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. Ideas proved more durable than empires. The fallen civilization became a foundation others did not know they stood upon. Roads guided trade centuries later. City planning influenced urban life long after the original purpose faded. Even calendars bore traces of ancient observation. Time itself remembered. The people who once labored anonymously, farmers, artisans, laborers, left the deepest mark of all. Their methods shaped agriculture. Their crafts shaped industry. Their endurance shaped culture. History rarely names them. But civilization is built by the unnamed. The empire's mistakes also survived. Arrogance was inherited as much as wisdom. Successor states repeated patterns. Centralized power, unchecked inequality, reliance on conquest. They believed collapse happened only to others. The fallen civilization watched silently as history repeated. Yet something remarkable occurred. As centuries passed, humanity began to study the past, not merely as legend, but as evidence. The rise and fall of civilizations became subjects of inquiry rather than fate. People began to ask not what happened, but why. Understanding emerged slowly. The fallen empire became one data point among many, part of a broader human story. Its collapse no longer symbolized divine punishment alone, but systemic failure, complex, preventable, instructive. This shift mattered. It meant the civilization had achieved a form of immortality not through domination, but through contribution. Its existence expanded human self-awareness. It taught that greatness is temporary, but learning can be cumulative. Modern cities rose where ancient ones fell. Steel replaced stone. Machines replaced muscle. Knowledge spread faster than ever imagined. Yet beneath this progress lay familiar challenges: inequality, ambition, environmental strain, conflict. The echoes remained relevant. People still walked the line between mastery and humility, still believed progress was permanent, still forgot that complexity requires care, and still returned to the ruins. Travelers stood among fallen walls, feeling small before the weight of time. They wondered how such brilliance could fade, and whether their own world might one day look the same. This wonder was the final gift. The fallen civilization had given humanity perspective. It reminded future generations that history is not a straight path upward, but a cycle of creation and collapse, shaped by choice. That endurance depends not on strength alone, but on adaptability, empathy, and restraint. The civilization was no longer alive. But it was not dead. It lived in cautionary tales, in borrowed laws, in repurposed stones, in rediscovered texts, in the quiet understanding that no society exists outside history. Its immortality was not in monuments, but in meaning. As long as humans build, question, remember, and learn, the echoes of that ancient civilization continue to speak, not as rulers, not as gods, but as witnesses. And in those echoes, humanity finds both warning and hope, proof that while civilizations fall, the story of human striving never truly ends.
Please subscribe the channel and press the bell button to get more interesting stories.